Hello friends, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink with a couple of mini slimline cards using what else but Distress Oxide sprays and Crackle paste and the spring BOHO circle stencil that I've used in a lot of videos recently. So for these cards, I have some Canson XL watercolor paper, the stencil, and my Crackle paste. And this time I am applying the stencil on an angle, and then I'm going to move it and then angle it and apply it a second time, just making sure not to overlap what I just stenciled because it would smear. And for me, that's kind of definitely stepping out of the box. I'm always so linear with the way I see things, etc. So I applied it the first time, and then I'm going to do it a second time, making a big old mess because I didn't pull out my like stencil board by Wendy Vecchi, which I should, as usual, because yeah, it has the non-stick mat on it and everything, but I just kept working with this and making a mess. So I did it a second time because why not do more than one? Plus this again was an experiment. I had a vague idea in my head. People ask me about that. It's like, what's your thought process? How do you create? Like, how do you come up with what you do? It varies, but with this specifically, I had a vague idea. I had a rough idea of the colors I wanted to use, and then I knew the stamp set I wanted to use, and then the stencil just became part of it, of course, because it just goes with everything. And then Crackle paste, because I'm obsessed with Crackle paste. It's fun. So, applied the paste. Let these completely dry. A lot of times I speed it up with my heat tool. Just be careful when using your heat tool with paste because it can cause a lot of paste. It can cause it to like bubble and create weird things. With Crackle paste, I speed it up with my heat tool, but I'm not like trying to melt it like you do with embossing powder. So the paste is completely dry. Now I have a non-stick mat out and my Distress Oxide sprays. And just experimenting. The color combo just became a thing of its own. So I was using Twisted Citron. That's that bright green because I'm obsessed with that color lately, especially in the Oxide. It does interesting things. There's a bit of blue pigment in there that just love. And then Shaded Lilac. Speckled Egg because it goes with everything. I'm obsessed with that one. And then I pulled out Pumice Stone because that's not one I use very often. And I really, really like what Pumice Stone and Speckled Egg do together. So I was just spraying with water, spraying with Oxide sprays, drawing, blotting, playing. Like just seeing what would happen. I really like to hold my fingers against the nozzle of the sprays. Like I hold my fingers and then I only press the nozzle about halfway down. And that's what creates those like splat effects rather than a full-on spray. So, and again, experimenting. Just layering colors, adding splatters and splats and all that kind of stuff until I was happy with it. And it's just funny how I used the exact same colors, did technically the exact same thing, but they're completely different backgrounds. Like how things just do. That's where the fun is. I recommend it. Even if you're not planning on finishing cards, like to sit and do backgrounds, like play with some pastes and stencils and sprays and use inks, whatever floats your boat, and just see what happens. It's fun. So for my main image, it's the Sketch Tulip stamp set. This came out years ago. Still an absolute favorite of mine that I like to pull out and use. I've done multiple videos on it. This is what was like my main goal with these cards. So I'm also stamping that onto just Canson XL watercolor paper. And I used my anti-static powder tool and then inked up the stamp with clear embossing ink. I obviously hadn't cleaned off the stamp very well the last time I used it. So it transferred some of that, it was probably black ink or whatever, to the watercolor paper, which is fine because I'm going to heat emboss over it. So I'm not concerned about it. And then without even melting the embossing powder, I poured the embossing powder over, but then I flipped it around and stamped it a second time. I wasn't as good about keeping my fingers off the cardstock, so I did get some of the embossing powder clinging to where my fingers had touched. But I just used a paintbrush and brushed it off. With an image like this, it's pretty easy. Usually if it's a sentiment, I either have to redo it, or it just depends on what's going on, whether or not I can brush away the embossing powder. And the embossing powder I'm using is Simon's cream embossing powder that I am also obsessed with. I'm loving it. I didn't think I would when they first released it, but I genuinely love it. With watercolor paper, it's like the perfect color, because it's, when you think cream, you think a lot deeper, you know, like a stark, drastic difference from white. But I find it's perfect with watercolor paper. And I keep using it more and more because I find that white embossing powder is too obvious, you know, because most watercolor papers are not white. And I don't honestly care. It doesn't bother me that much. Anyway, for the actual watercoloring, so these images are heat embossed. All I'm using is 2 of those same Distress Oxide sprays. I've done multiple videos showing watercoloring with the sprays. So I'm using the shaded Lilac and the Twisted Citron. And trying very hard, and I've mentioned this a lot, trying very hard not to use a ton of color. Like trying to use more water, trying to get those lighter areas. I was really aiming to get these tulips, like the blooms themselves, kind of like a pale purple. I had some pale purple tulips in my kitchen that I'd picked up at Costco. You know, one of those ones in the big glass jars that have just a little bit of water at the bottom, and they were gorgeous. They've already bloomed and done their thing. I didn't even get a chance to take a picture to show the comparison, but that's what inspired this card. And then I need to figure out, I think I have to wait till like the fall, because I want to plant them, you know, and hopefully I can get them to grow. I don't have a very good green thumb, but anyway, trying to keep these tulips very pale. So I did clean water. I had just applied the Distress Oxide spray to just my little plastic palette. So I apply water first to the area, and then I just pick up the Oxide spray and just kind of am tapping it on and moving it around a little bit, not a lot, because because they're Oxide sprays, they move with water. So I did the blooms, and then all the greenery I'm doing with the Twisted Citron, and doing the exact same thing, just applying water to all the areas and then picking up the color and applying it. And apologies, my hair, I was having like the baddest of bad hair days, I'm pretty sure, when I was filming this, and it's always like piled on top of my head, and I don't realize until I'm editing that I was right in front of the camera lens, you know, as I'm like looking and seeing and painting and not paying attention to, you know, what's being filmed. So my hair gets in the way a lot. Anywho, did that to both the images. And again, Twisted Citron Oxide. It's just, I love it. There is this like really light blue pigment that sometimes comes out, and it does. You can see it in the photos at the end. It just, the blue kind of comes out. And even like shaded Lilac has a bit of a pink in it, just a bit. It's interesting with the Oxide sprays, how you can really, like, you know, these unexpected little things will crop out, and I love it. So once those were painted, I let them completely dry, which didn't take very long. And then I used the coordinating wafer die, and I'm just taping it into place with washi tape so that die doesn't move around. And then I die cut those in my die cut machine. And then for the sentiment, I fell in love with the pumice stone. I think this was possibly the first time I ever actually used this Distress Oxide spray. I loved it, and I don't have any cardstock remotely close to this color. So to rectify that, I just used the Oxide spray and painted it on a scrap of the same watercolor paper. If you were really finicky, you could just use the Distress Oxide ink pad and like scrape that across. It would be more even, but I'm not too concerned about that. And besides, I like that texture. Again, it depends on the look I'm going for and what I'm doing. But with cards like this, the texture is just, that's what it's all about. So I just painted that Oxide spray directly onto the cardstock. And then I'm going to dry this with my heat tool and make sure it's completely dry, because I want to heat emboss the sentiments onto this little piece of watercolor paper. And on camera, it looks very, like the sentiment just kind of like fades into it. It doesn't. You can see it in the pictures at the end, and in real life, like the sentiment really does stand out. Even though this isn't the norm for me, you guys know I love like the bright colors and all that kind of stuff. But sometimes like soft and pastel and just that sort of a thing, there's just something about it, especially it's in springtime, even though while I was editing this yesterday, it was snowing like crazy here. So fun times. But anywho, I stamped the sentiment, the Just For You sentiment from that Sketch Tulip stamp set, and heat embossed it with that same cream embossing powder. And then once that was melted, I just used my little guillotine paper trimmer here to trim these down into individual sentiment strips. And then while I had my paper trimmer out, I'm also going to trim those backgrounds that I had used the Crackle paste and the Distress Oxide sprays on. And yes, people have asked me, like, do you notice if like the Crackle paste, if it flakes off or anything? Little bits sometimes here and there, especially like when I'm cutting them down, or if I really warp the piece with tons of water and sprays and then I'm flattening it out again, like sometimes a little bit might flake off. I don't worry about it. Again, texture, I don't worry about it. So I trimmed that down, and then my card bases were some heavyweight Simon's smooth white cardstock that I cut to 6 1/4 by 6 1/2. That's why I have that washi tape on my trimmer, because the edge of the washi tape marks the 6 1/4 mark. And then I put a line with a Sharpie marker to mark the 6 1/2 inch mark. And when I score these at 3 1/4, these end up being 3 1/4 by 6 1/4 inch mini slimline cards. So they're scored, card bases are ready to go. I'm putting the card bases into my MISTI with this Tulip stamp again. And I've shown this in many videos as well. Inking up stamps with multiple colors, regardless of whether you're using Distress Oxides or other pigment inks. It gets a little harder with dye inks because it's harder to see where you've applied the ink. So that's why I like the Oxides for this. But I basically just used like kind of the edge and the corners of the ink pads. And I inked it up first with the Shaded Lilac Distress Oxide ink. And then I'm just using a dry baby wipe to wipe off areas where like the stems were. Again, not being super perfect with it, but just cleaning up just that little bit, you know, as much as I can, but also not worrying about it too much. And then I do the exact same thing with the Twisted Citron. Little dry baby wipe here. I use Costco's Kirkland baby wipes. Highly recommend, because they're plant-based and they're also the best. I've used a lot. I have many children. I've tried probably every single brand out there, and these were always the best ones. And they have the least to no little lint, you know, pieces. And again, plant-based, which is awesome. So wiping off the excess, inking up the stamp, wiping off the areas I don't want, and then stamping, cleaning off the stamp, repeating the process with the other color. Super simple, super easy, and it just gives it that extra something. This also would work like as a card front too, you know? So whatever floats your boats. Images like this that have like multiple lines just kind of give it that little extra something. So once I had the tulips stamped on the insides of both of my card bases, I took another sentiment from that Sketch Tulip set, and I'm going to ink up the sentiment with pumice stone Distress Oxide ink rather than black ink. So the sentiment again ends up being very subtle, but I was going for that. I didn't want like a harsh black sentiment on the inside since I didn't use any, which is again not the norm for me. It's just habit to like heat emboss sentiments on black, you know, stamp things in black, etc., etc. But since the card front has absolutely no black, I decided to go with just the colors I was using. So I lined up the little sentiment, inked that up with the pumice stone ink, stamped it a couple times just to make sure the sentiment was legible, and then repeated the process with the second card base. So just lining everything up, stamping, inking it up a second time, stamping it again. So then I've got my card base, like the inside's done. For the card fronts, I just pulled some hemp cord from my stash and wrapped that around a couple times. I did a double length and then wrapped that around the card front, holding it with my reverse tweezers. Absolute one of my favorite little tools. I've mentioned this many times. I have more than one pair. I think I have a couple pairs because one always likes to grow legs and walk off. So holding it with my reverse tweezers, tying it in a bow, trimming off the excess, and then repeating that with the second card front. And then to adhere the tulips and the sentiment, I'm just using some foam squares. Just popping those onto it. This helps to, especially to adhere over Crackle paste, embossing paste, whatever. Foam tape or liquid adhesive is the way to go. Tape runners, no. Yeah, they don't have enough like contact points, if that makes sense, over texture like that. So I like foam adhesive, whether it's foam squares or like foam rolls, whatever, and or liquid adhesive. It just works the best. So then I used the excess cardstock that was left over from trimming those card bases, because I get asked that too. It's like, why do you do, you know, what's the appeal of slimline cards and mini slimline cards, etc. Like, you're left with so much extra cardstock. I'm not. I use all my scraps regardless. I use them for die cutting, sentiments, whatever. Like, I use my scraps. But larger pieces like this are perfect to adhere together and then to use for dimension, because you're not going to see it. So they don't even have to be like fresh pieces, you know, from a card base. They can be the extra pieces of stuff that, you know, I messed up and that I stamped off wrong, or that I didn't like the ink blending, whatever. Rather than chucking them, it's like, I'll just cut them up and use them behind other things on card fronts, because again, you're not going to see it. So that's what I did. I just trimmed them down and applied, adhered them along the top and the bottom of the card fronts. I left the area where the cord was, so that everything adheres a little bit better. And then I adhered those to my card bases. So I've got those adhered into place. And by using this versus foam tape, I get that little bit of wiggle room. Although I've also shown in videos where I'll put liquid glue over foam tape. Again, wiggle room to straighten things, because eyeballing it, the older I get, the worse I get with it. And then as a final little embellishment, got to add a bit of bling. I have these Trinity Stamps Soapy Bubbles confetti mix. They're confetti, so they don't have the holes in it, but they have the raised edges like sequins. They're fun. So I just ordered those recently, and I was just like, ooh, got to stick those on, because they're just like iridescent / clear, so they just kind of go with everything. So sprinkled those throughout the card fronts, and then just adhered them into place with dabs of Craft Tacky Glue. And then once those are adhered, I'm going to pair these cards with some purple mini slimline envelopes from my stash. And that's going to finish them off. So trying to show the texture and the close-up here in the video. You can also see it better in the photos, which I'll also include in the video, but they'll also be on my blog as always. And then to get to my blog, I always link directly below the video in the description box. I have a link to my blog post. So you can click on that, check out the photos, etc. In my blog post, I also have picture links to all the supplies used, so you can check that out if you're interested. And then I list the supplies in the description box as well. So all that info, along with my social medias, all that stuff, is directly below the video if you're interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing, thumbs upping, commenting, all of it. I very much appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye!